I got to thinking about the Instapot and a pressure cooker. The great thing about a pressure cooker is it takes your food and heats it up and traps the moisture inside, and so the combination of the pressure and the heat cooks your food a lot faster. It's more energy efficient. The other thing that it does is, since it traps everything inside and cooks it quicker, your food is more healthy because it traps in all of those vitamins and nutrients, and it retains all of those things. It's healthier, pressure cooking is faster, and it's more energy efficient, but it's more pressure. More pressure. Life is like a pressure cooker, and if we respond to that pressure the right way, it can make us better, like that pressure cooker. The disciples knew what it was like to be under pressure. In this passage this morning, the disciples were facing a crowd, it says, with 5,000 men. And that doesn't even include the women and children. And they were hungry. Jesus goes to Philip and he asks him a question. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude come toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" At that point, do you think Philip felt any pressure? Jesus knew what he was going to do, but Philip didn't have a clue what to do. It reminds me of the story of a little boy, and he was trying really hard to reach the doorbell at a house, but he couldn't reach it. And there was an older man walking by, and he noticed that the boy is really struggling to reach that doorbell. And so he said, "Son," the older man said, "Son, let me help you out." And so he rang the doorbell. And then he turned and looked at the boy and said, "Son, what do we do next?" And the boy said, "I don't know about you, but I'm running." Pressure cooker, right? Well, life can be a pressure cooker. And there are times where we are under tremendous pressure, and we really don't know what to do. It's that way in the story in the Bible today. Now, Jesus had traveled all the way across the Sea of Galilee. He traveled to get some rest and some relief. And this multitude, this crowd had followed him all the way over there. And they had all settled in for the evening, and the sun was setting. Evening was coming, and their stomachs were growling because it was supper time. The Bible tells us, after these things, Jesus went over to the Sea of Galilee, which is also called the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw the signs which he had performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on a mountain and sat there with the disciples. And now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. And that began the pressure cooker problem of that day. There were actually two pressure cooker problems that day. The first was that the crowd lacked food. They were not just hungry, they were getting hangry. And John tells us that the men alone numbered 5,000, and then there were women and children, and so a conservative estimate is somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people were there. Now, the amazing thing about this to me is that Jesus knew the need before those people did. Nobody complained about being hungry yet, but Jesus knew that they were going to get hungry. Food and being hungry, the first pressure cooker problem. But there was a second pressure cooker problem. The disciples lacked faith. Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing the great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for Jesus himself knew what he would do. This was a faith test, and the first person to take this test was Philip. Jesus asked Philip a rhetorical question. You see, he really wasn't asking Philip to go out and buy food. He already knew what he was going to do. He was simply testing Philip. And Philip flunked that test big time. Philip answered him this. He said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. Now, Jesus didn't ask the question, how much? He asked the question, where? Where do we go? But instead, Philip gets out his calculator and begins to figure out how much food would be needed and how much money it would cost. Just as a point of information, a denarian of silver coins was commonly used in Jesus' time, and it was equivalent to a full day's work in the vineyard. Philip calculated that it would take 200 days' wages to feed this crowd. In today's money, that'd be roughly equivalent to $30,000. Philip quickly figured out several things. First, there was not any place to buy that much food. Second, even if there was a place to buy that much food, he didn't have the money to pay for it. Third, even if there was a place and the money, there wasn't enough time to gather it all together. Fourth, even if there was enough time, everybody would only get a little bit of food. So Philip looked at the multitude of people and the sum of money, and he shrugged his shoulders and he said, "This is impossible." Philip was like us, way too practical, a statistical pessimist. There are always people who are willing to take the time to figure out how something cannot work or why things are so bad. In the Los Angeles Times years ago, Barry Siegel wrote an article entitled, "The World May End with a Splash." In this article, he shows how ridiculous some negative thinking can be. He, very in tongue-in-cheek, sarcastically says this: "Alarmists who worry about things like worldwide nuclear bombs and pesticide poisonings may be overlooking some much more dire catastrophes. Consider what some scientists predict. If everyone ordered magazines from your nephew doing a fundraiser for junior high band and kept them, instead of throwing them away, the magazine's weight will sink the continent by 100 feet, and so sometime soon we'll all be inundated by the oceans. If beachgoers keep returning home with as much sand clinging to them as they do now, 80% of the country's coastline will disappear in 10 years. He said it's been reported that pickles cause cancer, wars, and automobile accidents. And it's been reported this because 99.9% of cancer victims had eaten pickles sometime in their life. So have 100% of all soldiers and 99.7% of those involved in car accidents. Moreover, he said those born in 1839 who ate pickles have suffered a 100% mortality rate. Now, we laugh at all of this, but it just goes to show that we can all be a statistical pessimist. We can all be a little bit like Philip. disciple Andrew. Well, he did a little bit better. While Philip was crunching the numbers and figuring out why they couldn't feed the 15,000, Andrew went off looking for food. And here's what he finds. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's this lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" Well, Andrew wasn't too proud of what he found. He finds this little boy with the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked at the size, the multitude of the crowd, and then he looked at the source of the meal which he had. And where Philip said impossible, Andrew says illogical. Both these men had made one fatal flaw. They had both calculated how to feed the crowd without Christ. We do the same thing all the time. Unfortunately, whenever the pressure's on in our life, the Lord Jesus becomes our last resort instead of our first resource. I'm convinced that Jesus was a lot less concerned about the lack of food and a lot more concerned about the lack of faith. What broke Jesus' heart, I think, was that he had given those disciples every reason to have faith and no reason to doubt. You see, the disciples had seen Jesus turn water into wine. The disciples had seen Jesus heal a nobleman's son. The disciples had seen Jesus heal a paralytic man. And yet, they still needed that faith of a mountain to move a mustard seed. They still didn't get it. And a lot of us still don't get it either. Even though we look back on our life and see how God led us through some really hard times, God provided for us time after time after time. When the pressure is on, when the worry meter goes up, we just don't get it. Well, I want to tell you something today. If you're facing a situation that you think impossible, if you're facing a situation where you think that's improbable, remember Luke 18:27. The things which are impossible with humans are possible with God. If you're facing a problem that you're thinking the solution is illogical, then just remember Isaiah 55:9. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. If you think about it, that little boy who came forward sure had a lot more faith than the disciples. He came forward with these 5 little flat, hard barley loaves that were brittle. They were about the size of a pancake of flour tortilla in South Texas terms. And the word that's used for those fish was not 2 big old trout that you caught out in the bay. The word that's used is equivalent to 2 little sardines. Here we have 12 full-grown disciples who had seen Jesus do miracle after miracle after miracle, and they said impossible. And here we have one little boy who probably just barely met Jesus, and the little boy believed. Speaking of little boys, I heard a story about a little boy recently. It was a story about a little boy who got into a heated argument with his sister about a brownie, the last brownie that was left on the plate at home. And brother and sister were fighting over who's going to get that last brownie, and mother heard all the commotion, and she walked into the kitchen and said, "Well, what would Jesus do?" And the little quick-witted boy that reminds me of Jackson right here, he said, "That's easy. Mom, Jesus would just break the brownie in half and feed 5,000 with it. Where the disciples saw lack, that little boy in our story today saw the Lord. Where the disciples saw a multitude, that little boy saw a miracle. Where the disciples saw a crowd, that little boy saw Christ. That's the kind of faith that's motivated with just 5 little dinner rolls and 2 sardines. A faith that gives without equivocation, without reservation, without hesitation. So notice what happens in our story. Jesus has everyone sit down. There's place on the grass for all 15 to 20,000 to sit. And they got as much fish and bread as they wanted with 12 baskets left over. I think it was a little gotcha to those disciples that there's 12 left over. But there's 2 lessons I think we can take away from pressure cooker living. Number 1, never doubt what God can do. God's in the miracle business. Number 2, never deny whatever God asks of you. God's in the multiplication business. The whole point of this miracle to me was not to feed the stomachs of these people, but to show them that Jesus was the one who could feed their soul. When they were hungry, Jesus was the bread of life and the living water. When the pressure cooker of life was about to explode, what they needed to do was turn to Jesus. And that's the same for us. The pressures of life are meant to turn us toward Jesus. The things which are impossible for you and you and you and you are possible with God. Amen.